Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their afternoons shopping or gossiping, she was at the local gym, throwing punches at heavy bags and perfecting her footwork. At 17, she was already being scouted by college wrestling programs across the country. Her powerful right arm could deliver devastating blows that had earned her 3 consecutive state championships in women's boxing. The attack happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Sarah was walking home from her part-time job at the community center, where she taught self-defense classes to younger kids. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the apartment buildings in her East Los Angeles neighborhood. She had taken this route hundreds of times before, never thinking twice about her safety. 3 men emerged from an alley between 2 buildings. Sarah recognized them immediately. Local gang members who had been causing trouble in the area for months. The leader, a man in his 20s with tattoos covering his neck, stepped directly into her path. "You're that girl who thinks she's tough," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Been hearing about you teaching kids to fight back against us." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She assessed the situation quickly. 3 attackers, no witnesses nearby, and her phone was dead. She shifted her stance slightly, preparing to defend herself but trying not to appear aggressive. "I don't want any trouble," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving the leader while tracking the movement of the other 2 men who were slowly circling around behind her. "Too late for that, little boxer," the leader sneered. "See, you've been making our job harder. Kids in this neighborhood used to be scared. Now they think they can stand up to us because of your little classes." Sarah knew she had to act fast. The men were positioning themselves to attack from multiple angles. She feinted left, then spun right, trying to break through their circle and run toward the main street where there would be people and traffic. She almost made it. The leader caught her arm just as she tried to push past him. In one swift, brutal motion, he twisted her right arm behind her back with such force that the sound of breaking bone echoed off the apartment walls. Sarah screamed as white-hot pain shot through her entire body. "There," the leader said, releasing her arm as she collapsed to the ground. "Let's see you throw punches now." The other 2 men kicked her in the ribs before all 3 walked away, laughing and making comments about how the neighborhood's little hero wouldn't be causing them any more problems. Sarah lay on the concrete for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Her right arm hung at an unnatural angle, and every breath sent sharp pains through her chest. She managed to crawl toward the main street, leaving a trail of blood from cuts on her knees and face. A passing motorist found her and called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors delivered news that shattered her world even more than the attack itself. The break in her arm was severe, a compound fracture that had damaged nerves and torn muscles. Even after surgery and months of physical therapy, she would never regain full use of her dominant arm. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez said gently as he showed her the X-rays. "The damage is extensive. We've done everything we can, but you'll have limited mobility and strength in that arm for the rest of your life." Sarah stared at the images of her shattered bones, feeling her dreams crumble around her. Wrestling scholarships were out of the question now. Her boxing career was over before it had truly begun. The self-defense classes she taught would have to stop. How could she teach others to protect themselves when she couldn't even use her own dominant arm? Her mother, Maria, held her left hand as tears streamed down both their faces. "Mia, we'll get through this," she whispered. "You're strong, stronger than they think." But Sarah didn't feel strong. She felt broken. Not just physically, but emotionally. The attack hadn't just taken away her arm's functionality, it had stolen her identity, her future, and her confidence. The police investigation went nowhere. The 3 attackers were known gang members, but there were no witnesses, and they had alibis provided by other gang associates. Detective Williams, who handled Sarah's case, was sympathetic but honest about the limitations they faced. "I know this isn't what you want to hear," he told Sarah during one of his visits to the hospital. "But without witnesses or physical evidence linking them to the attack, our hands are tied." Sarah's recovery was slow and frustrating. Physical therapy sessions were torture as she struggled to regain even basic movement in her right arm. Simple tasks like brushing her teeth or writing her name became monumental challenges. She had to learn to do everything with her left hand: eating, writing, even throwing a punch. The worst part wasn't the physical limitations, though. It was the fear. Sarah, who had once walked confidently through any neighborhood, now jumped at shadows. She couldn't sleep without checking her locks multiple times. The girl who had taught others to be brave was now afraid of her own neighborhood. Her friends tried to be supportive, but Sarah could see the pity in their eyes. Teachers at school spoke to her in softer voices, as if she were made of glass. College recruiters, who had once called regularly, stopped reaching out. Sarah felt like she was disappearing, becoming invisible in a world that only valued what she used to be able to do. 3 months after the attack, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She was going to join the military, not because she felt patriotic or wanted adventure, but because she needed to prove to herself that she wasn't the broken victim everyone saw when they looked at her. Her mother was horrified. "Sarah, no. You can barely use your arm. How can you even think about the military?" But Sarah's mind was made up. She had researched extensively and learned about military programs for people with disabilities. More importantly, she had learned about adaptive training techniques that could help her work around her limitations. The recruiting office was located in a strip mall between a pizza place and a dry cleaner. Sergeant First Class Johnson, a stocky African-American man in his 40s, looked skeptical when Sarah explained her situation. "Miss Martinez," he said carefully, "I admire your determination, but military service requires full physical capability. With your arm injury, you wouldn't pass the basic physical fitness requirements." Sarah had anticipated this response. She pulled out a folder containing medical records, physical therapy progress reports, and letters of recommendation from her former coaches and teachers. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said firmly. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that one good arm and a determined mind can be worth more than 2 healthy arms without the will to use them." Sergeant Johnson studied the documents, then looked at Sarah with new interest. There was something in her eyes, not desperation or false bravado, but a quiet determination that he had seen in some of the best soldiers he had known. "Tell you what," he said finally, "I can't guarantee anything, but I know someone who might be interested in meeting you. Ever heard of Navy SEALs?" Sarah's heart began to race. She had heard of SEALs, of course, but the idea of elite military units had always seemed like something from movies, not real life. Certainly not something that could be part of her reality. "I'm not saying you could become a SEAL," Sergeant Johnson continued, "but I know a guy, retired SEAL instructor, who works with adaptive training programs. He might be willing to evaluate your potential." As Sarah walked out of the recruiting office that day, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the night of the attack: hope. Not the naive hope of her childhood dreams returning, but something harder and more realistic. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she could forge a new path forward. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing outside a nondescript warehouse in San Diego, her palms sweating despite the cool morning air. The building looked like it could house anything: auto parts, storage units, or abandoned dreams. She checked the address 3 times before finally walking toward the unmarked entrance. Commander Marcus Tank Williams opened the door before she could knock. At first glance, he didn't look like the legendary Navy SEAL that Sergeant Johnson had described. He was shorter than Sarah had expected, maybe 5'8", with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. But when he shook her left hand, noting immediately that she offered her non-dominant hand, Sarah felt the calloused strength that spoke of decades of intense training. "So you're the girl who wants to prove that one arm is enough," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Johnson told me about your situation. I've got to be honest with you, Sarah. What you're asking for isn't just difficult. Most people would call it impossible." Tank led her into the warehouse, which had been converted into a comprehensive training facility. Obstacle courses snaked through one section, while another area contained every piece of exercise equipment Sarah had ever seen, plus many she hadn't. The walls were covered with photos of military units, medals, and certificates that spoke of serious accomplishments. "Before we go any further," Tank said, turning to face her, "I need to understand why you're really here. Are you trying to prove something to the guys who hurt you? To your family? To yourself?" Sarah had expected this question and had prepared what she thought was the right answer. But standing in this place, surrounded by reminders of excellence and sacrifice, she found herself telling the truth instead. "All of those things," she said quietly. "But mostly, I need to know that I'm not just going to spend the rest of my life being afraid. I need to know that what happened to me doesn't define who I am." Tank nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But understand this. If I agree to train you, it won't be some feel-good story about overcoming obstacles. I'm going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed. I'm going to demand more from your left arm than most people give with two good arms. And when you want to quit, and you will want to quit, I'm going to make you keep going anyway." The first month was brutal. Tank started with basic fitness assessments, and Sarah quickly realized how much her injury had affected her overall conditioning. Tasks that would have been simple before the attack now required complete relearning and adaptation. Rope climbing became an exercise in creative problem-solving. Sarah learned to use her legs and left arm in ways that compensated for her limited right arm function. Pull-ups required developing grip strength in her left hand that exceeded what most people achieved with both hands working together. "Stop thinking about what you can't do," Tank barked during one particularly challenging session. "Every time you think, 'I can't because of my arm,' you're giving those guys who attacked you another victory. Focus on what you can do better than anyone else expects." The psychological training was even harder than the physical challenges. Tank brought in other veterans who had overcome severe injuries, soldiers who had lost legs but still completed marathons, Marines who had lost arms but still competed in shooting competitions, sailors who had overcome traumatic brain injuries to return to complex technical roles. "Listen to their stories," Tank told Sarah after a session with 3 Iraq War veterans. "Not because I want you to feel better about your situation, but because I want you to understand that adapting to overcome isn't about inspiration. It's about systematic problem-solving and refusing to accept limitations that others want to place on you." Sarah began to understand that her training wasn't just about building physical capabilities. Tank was reconstructing her entire approach to challenges. Instead of seeing problems as barriers, she learned to view them as puzzles, requiring creative solutions. Hand-to-hand combat presented the biggest challenge. Sarah's boxing background was built around her dominant right hand delivering power shots. Now she had to completely reimagine her fighting style around her left hand, using her limited right arm function for balance and distraction rather than offense. "Forget everything you knew about fighting," Tank instructed during her first combat session. "You're not trying to fight the way you used to fight. You're creating a completely new fighting style that maximizes your current capabilities." Sarah worked with various training partners, learning to use speed and precision where she had once relied on power. She discovered that fighters who faced her often struggled to adapt to her unconventional style. Her left hand became incredibly fast and accurate, while her right arm learned to create openings and deflect attacks in ways that complemented her new approach. The breakthrough came during her 3rd month of training. Sarah was sparring with a Marine veteran who outweighed her by 40 pounds and had 2 fully functional arms. He had been dominating their previous sessions, but Tank had been pushing Sarah to stop trying to match his strength and instead exploit his assumptions. "He expects you to fight like someone with a disability," Tank had told her. "Use that expectation against him." During this particular sparring session, Sarah noticed her opponent consistently left his left side exposed, apparently assuming she couldn't generate enough power from her left hand to threaten him there. Instead of telegraphing a big power shot, Sarah used a series of quick jabs to set up an opening, then delivered a perfectly timed left hook that dropped the much larger man to his knees. The training room went silent. Sarah looked around at the other students and instructors, suddenly aware that something significant had just happened. "Well, I'll be damned," Tank said quietly. "Do you realize what you just did?" Sarah was breathing hard but felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced since before the attack, complete confidence in her physical abilities. "You just developed a fighting style that's not adapted for your disability," Tank continued. "It's optimized for your specific capabilities. That Marine has been out fighting people with 2 good arms for years, and you just made his advantages work against him." Word of Sarah's progress began to spread through the military training community. Officers and instructors who had initially been skeptical started paying attention. Her story became less about overcoming disability and more about innovative approaches to combat training. Tank began incorporating Sarah's techniques into his regular curriculum, showing able-bodied students how her adaptations could improve their own fighting effectiveness. She wasn't being treated as an inspiration anymore. She was being recognized as someone who had developed genuinely valuable tactical innovations. The mental transformation was just as dramatic as the physical one. Sarah found herself thinking differently about every aspect of her life. Challenges that had seemed insurmountable after the attack now appeared as problems requiring systematic analysis and creative solutions. Her confidence returned, but it was different from her teenage confidence. Before the attack, she had been confident because things came easily to her. Now she was confident because she had proven to herself that she could adapt and overcome anything. During her final month of training, Tank arranged for Sarah to demonstrate her techniques to a group of active duty SEALs who were visiting the facility. These were elite operators who had seen combat around the world, and Sarah was nervous about performing in front of them. "Just show them what you've learned," Tank told her before the demonstration. "Don't try to impress them. Just be who you've become." Sarah sparred with 3 different SEAL team members, each presenting different challenges. Against each one, she demonstrated the fighting style she had developed: fast, precise, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. After the demonstration, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, the senior SEAL officer present, approached Sarah with an expression of genuine respect. "That was impressive," he said simply. "Tank tells me you're interested in military service. Have you considered that we might be interested in what you could teach us?" Sarah looked at Tank, who was trying to hide a proud smile. "What Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez is saying," Tank explained, "is that maybe it's time to stop thinking about you joining the military to prove something. Maybe it's time to start thinking about what the military could learn from you." 6 months earlier, Sarah had been a broken teenager whose dreams had been shattered by a brutal attack. Now she was being recruited by Navy SEALs, not despite her injury, but because of the innovations and capabilities she had developed in response to it. As she drove home that evening, Sarah realized that the 3 men who had attacked her had been wrong about one thing. They had tried to cripple her arm to break her spirit, but they had actually forced her to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. Her damaged right arm hadn't ended her story. It had been the beginning of a completely new chapter. The invitation arrived on official Navy letterhead, but Tank delivered it personally to Sarah's apartment. She read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. The U.S. Navy was requesting her participation in the development of adaptive combat training protocols for military personnel with combat-related injuries. She would work directly with active duty SEALs and other special operations units. "This isn't charity, Sarah," Tank said, as he watched her process the information. "They want your expertise. What you've developed isn't just impressive for someone with a disability. It's tactically innovative for anyone." 2 months later, Sarah found herself at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, wearing the civilian contractor credentials that gave her access to some of the most elite military training facilities in the world. Her official title was Adaptive Combat Techniques Specialist, but the SEALs she worked with had started calling her something else entirely: Professor. The nickname stuck because Sarah's approach to training was unlike anything the military had seen before. Instead of trying to work around limitations, she taught students to identify and maximize unconventional advantages. Her methods weren't just helpful for injured personnel, they were making healthy soldiers more effective too. During her first month at Coronado, Sarah worked with Petty Officer First Class David Chen, a SEAL who had lost partial function in his right leg after an IED explosion in Afghanistan. David was struggling with standard rehabilitation protocols and facing the possibility of medical discharge. "The doctors keep telling me what I can't do anymore," David confided during one of their training sessions. "But nobody's helping me figure out what I might be able to do better than before." Sarah recognized the frustration in his voice. It was the same despair she had felt lying on that hospital bed months earlier. But now she had tools to address it. "Show me your shooting stance," she instructed. David assumed the standard military shooting position, favoring his uninjured leg for support. Sarah immediately saw the problem. He was fighting against his new physical reality instead of adapting to optimize it. "Forget everything you knew about shooting positions," Sarah said, echoing Tank's words from her own training. "Your injured leg isn't a weakness if you build your stance around it differently." Working together, they developed a modified shooting position that used David's injured leg for lower center of gravity and stability rather than primary support. Within weeks, David's accuracy scores were higher than they had been before his injury. Word of Sarah's success stories spread quickly through the special operations community. Soon, she was receiving requests to work with injured personnel from Army Rangers, Air Force Pararescue, and Marine Force Recon units. Each case required different innovations, and Sarah found herself constantly learning and developing new techniques. The breakthrough that would define her legacy came during a training exercise with SEAL Team 5. The team was preparing for a mission that required infiltrating a heavily defended facility, but their planning was stuck on a particular tactical problem. Standard assault techniques weren't viable given the target's defenses, and unconventional approaches required capabilities that traditional training hadn't provided. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, the team leader, approached Sarah with an unusual request. "We've been watching your training methods, and we think your approach to problem-solving might apply to tactical planning too. Mind taking a look at our situation?" Sarah studied the mission parameters and immediately saw parallels to her own experience. The team was trying to use standard capabilities against a situation that required adapted approaches. "You're thinking like someone who has 2 arms when this mission requires left-hand thinking," she told the team during their briefing. Over the next week, Sarah worked with the SEALs to completely reimagine their approach. Instead of trying to overpower the facility's defenses, they developed a strategy that used the defenders' expectations against them. The plan incorporated several techniques that Sarah had developed during her own training, using apparent weaknesses as tactical advantages, creating multiple simultaneous distractions, and exploiting opponents' assumptions about capabilities. The mission was a complete success. More importantly, the tactical innovations that Sarah had helped develop were immediately incorporated into the standard SEAL training curriculum. 6 months into her work with the Navy, Sarah received a call that brought her story full circle. Detective Williams from the Los Angeles Police Department contacted her with news about her case. "We've arrested the 3 men who attacked you," he said. They made the mistake of targeting an off-duty Marine, and this time we have witnesses, physical evidence, and a victim who fought back. The trial was set for 3 months later. Sarah's initial reaction was relief, but as the court date approached, she found herself experiencing anxiety that she hadn't felt since her early days of training with Tank. "You're nervous about facing them again," Tank observed during one of their regular check-ins. "That's normal, but remember, you're not the same person they attacked." Sarah knew he was right, but the thought of sitting in a courtroom while her attackers were present still triggered the fear responses that she had worked so hard to overcome. The day of the trial, Sarah walked into the Los Angeles County Courthouse wearing her Navy contractor credentials. Her mother accompanied her, along with Tank and several SEAL team members who had requested permission to attend in support. When the 3 defendants were brought into the courtroom, Sarah felt a moment of recognition and remembered fear. But as she looked at them, she realized something had fundamentally changed in her perception. They no longer seemed like the dangerous predators who had shattered her world. They looked like what they really were: small, angry men whose own fear had driven them to try to break someone they saw as a threat to their false sense of power. During her testimony, Sarah recounted the attack clearly and without emotion. She described the physical damage they had caused and the months of recovery that followed. But when the defense attorney tried to portray her as a victim whose life had been ruined, Sarah corrected him. "They injured my arm," she said clearly. "They didn't ruin my life. If anything, they forced me to discover capabilities I never knew I had." The prosecutor then asked Sarah to describe what she had accomplished since the attack. As she detailed her work with Navy SEALs, the tactical innovations she had developed, and the soldiers she had helped return to active duty, Sarah watched the defendant's expressions change from smugness to something approaching disbelief. "So, would you say these men succeeded in their apparent goal of ending your potential to help others?" the prosecutor asked. Sarah looked directly at her attackers as she answered. "No. They tried to cripple my arm to break my spirit. Instead, they forced me to become stronger and more capable than I ever imagined possible. Their attack wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my real contribution to the world." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The leader received a sentence of 12 years in prison, while his accomplices received 8 and 6 years respectively. After the sentencing, Sarah's mother hugged her tightly. "Mija, I'm so proud of who you've become," she said through tears. Tank, who had been unusually quiet during the proceedings, finally spoke up. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. When Johnson first called me about you, I thought I'd be doing charity work, helping a disabled girl feel better about herself. I was completely wrong." Sarah looked at him questioningly. "You didn't overcome your disability," Tank continued. "You transformed it into a tactical advantage. The techniques you've developed are being taught at every special operations training facility in the country. You've made our military more effective." 3 years later, Sarah stood before a crowd of wounded veterans and their families at the Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. She had been invited to speak at the opening of a new adaptive training facility that bore her name, the Sarah Martinez Center for Tactical Innovation. In the audience sat dozens of military personnel who had been through her training programs, including David Chen, who had not only avoided medical discharge, but had been promoted and selected for a specialized unit that utilized his unique capabilities. "When I was 17, Sarah began her speech, 3 men tried to cripple my arm because they thought it would break my spirit and end my ability to help others defend themselves. They were wrong on every count." She paused, looking out at faces that reflected her own journey. Initial devastation transformed into determined adaptation. "They gave me a damaged arm, and I used it to develop combat techniques that have made our military more effective. They tried to make me afraid, and I used that fear to understand how to help others overcome their own limitations." They attempted to end my story, and instead they forced me to write a completely new and better chapter. As applause filled the auditorium, Sarah thought about that night in the alley where everything had changed. The three men who attacked her had intended to destroy her future, but they had actually created the foundation for achievements beyond anything she had originally imagined. Her right arm would never be the same, but that limitation had forced her to discover innovations that were now helping soldiers around the world. The attack that was meant to break her had instead forged her into someone whose influence extended far beyond anything she could have accomplished with two healthy arms and conventional dreams. Standing at the podium, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the techniques she had developed, Sarah realized the most profound truth of her journey. The men who tried to cripple her arm had actually proved that sometimes one determined arm, guided by an unbreakable spirit, really was enough to win. Not just for herself, but for countless others who would benefit from the strength she had discovered in her adaptation. The girl who had once defined herself by her powerful right hook had become a woman whose left-handed innovations were reshaping how America's military approached the challenges of combat and recovery. Her attackers had tried to end her story with violence, but Sarah had responded by writing a new story entirely, one that would continue inspiring and protecting others long after her own battles were won.